It's good to see each and every one of you. It's good, and we want to welcome our online streaming audience and the members who are watching online. Welcome and good morning, and it's great to be here to worship together. Before we start into this week's lesson, we're starting a new series called Relational Vampires. I want to explain something that's going to happen next week. It's the first Sunday in November. We usually have communion in the evening, but due to COVID and the closeness that communion brings us, we're going to not do it for the second time. But next Sunday morning, we will have communion. We're going to have the two tables set up here. There will be little juice cups, sealed, and saltine crackers. Okay? We had choices to make, and they said, well, should we get the cup with the wafer in it? And some of you remember we did that once. And the wafer, it's a wonder you all came back. That wafer was not food. I tasted cardboard that was better than that wafer. And it's not that communion, the wafer has to be delicious, but it shouldn't be terrible. So for everybody's safety, we'll have two tables individually wrapped, saltines like you get at a restaurant, with the cup. We'll have everybody come up, take a saltine, take the cup, and back at the seats, and then we'll take communion together. So that's what we're having. And if you online would want to join us on that, you can have juice ready and saltines, and you can touch your own food, so you're cool. All right? We're starting a new series this morning called Relational Vampires. And I've had some of you say, well, wait, man, should the church be involved in Halloween? I mean, you're talking about vampires and things like that. And I said, thought about it, and I said, yep, we should. It's nothing to do about the dead, because we believe in the resurrection and life forever. And so much of Halloween is just distorted, but it really adds to what we're going to talk about. 4 weeks of talking about relationships that aren't necessarily good. All right? If you think of the word vampire, the mythical creature sucks your blood, right? Sucks the blood out of you. Relational vampires, in our relationships, they suck the life out of you. They suck your life out. They take up time. They waste a lot of your life. And that's why we're calling it relational vampires. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit first where we're going to go in the next 3 weeks. Next week, we're going to talk about people who are critical. In our relationships, they're critical. You can never do anything right. You always struggle with it. The third week, we're going to talk about needy people. There's people that are just so needy. They cling to you. You can't hardly do anything. It's almost possible to get away from them. And as soon as you see them, there's always a need. Can you, like the lady with the dog. And then the fourth week, we're going to talk about how we love people who are hypocritical. There's a lot of Christians, claim to be Christians, claim to follow Christ, but their life doesn't reflect that at all. They're living as hypocrites, hypocritical life. And it's so important because Jesus said the greatest commandments was love God with everything you got, love others as yourself. And we're going to say, through this thing, we're looking at how do I love somebody? Today we're going to talk about control freaks. How do I love somebody who's a control freak, who's trying to control every aspect of my life? How do I love somebody who's critical, who always downs me? How do I love that person who's needy? How do I love that Christian who is a hypocrite and doesn't realize what they're doing? How do we love them without being controlled by them? And that's a big thing we're going to talk about today. How do we love those individuals who are incredibly controlling? Now, I want to ask you something. I asked the first service, how many of you know somebody who is a control freak? All right? How many of you wanted to raise your hand, but the person beside you wouldn't let you? That's the person we're going to talk about, okay? That's the people we're going to talk about. So just letting you know, all right? We're talking about control freaks. Unfortunately, when talking about this, I realize that there are people in a lot of your lives who controlled you, but they also hurt you. It can be through physical abuse, emotional abuse, something else. A person may have been an authority in your life. Could have been a parent. We've seen this tremendous thing in the last couple years of pastors, priests, being in that position that they were able to control and abuse people. But the majority of control freaks are not malicious. They're not hateful. They're not out to hurt you. Sometimes they could be just needy. Sometimes they're insecure. Sometimes they're just hurt people who are trying to keep you from being hurt by trying to run your life. All right? There's a lot of reasons. Control freaks, though, can be an emotional black hole. You know what a black hole is? It just absorbs and sucks everything in and disappears. And we will try to pour and help and do what they want, and it's never enough, and no matter what we give them, it's always more. If we give an inch, they want a yard. And if they don't get what they want, let me tell you how a control freak will often act. Now, I'm not talking about a violent control freak that will beat you or smack you. But often a control freak is trying to control you. Well, the first things they'll do is pout. They walk around pouting, moaning. You don't love me no more. You don't care no more. They're pouting. They whine. Just whine. I hate whining. I do it to kids, and I tell my kids lots of time, no, this is no whine Wednesday. You don't whine. We can't whine on Wednesday. And other times, they'll give you the silent treatment. Silent treatment. I won't talk to you. And that often bugs people to death, and I'm not sure why. We really should enjoy the silent treatment. And if you enjoy it, it makes a control freak absolutely freak out. You know what I mean? But, I'm not supposed to say things like that with this sermon. Anyway, they'll complain. Sometimes they'll walk away. And when you're around a control freak and you know it, you feel like you're walking on eggshells. I got to be so careful. I can't be myself. I can't upset the apple cart. It's not much different from people who are in the cycle of abuse. If you study the cycle of abuse, you will see it's a cycle. And I can't believe people live in the cycle, but they do. And it's always to get to the part where the person who's abused them will just shower them with gifts and say they're sorry and they're never going to do it again. It's a great little time, but then they go right back into it. And I don't know why anybody wants to live that way or dance that way in life. It's a terrible way to dance, and it's a terrible way to live. And we have to realize that. And if you're thinking about someone right now, don't point to them, please. That would be really awkward this morning, all right? But I want you to know it is difficult to love a controlling person. It is difficult to truly love a person who is constantly trying to control you. And one of the things that control freaks have is two main weapons. Use them all the time. They use threats and guilt. Threats and guilt. What's that look like? Well, in some fashion, they may openly threaten you. They could threaten you with physical harm. They could threaten leaving. They could try and cutting off money in the bank accounts and things like that. Or they can often imply a threat. Imply it. Sort of under the radar. Sort of give you I didn't really say that. Yeah, you did. You implied it. You implied it. It's intentional. And you have to be aware of that. You better do this or you're going to regret it. You better perform well or I'm going to punish you. If you don't do what I want in some form or fashion, you're going to pay for this. You'll pay for it. And we use threats. Some of you have daughters. And it could be boys, but I think it's often the boys will be the control freak in dating situations. And they can apply, to try to control your daughter and say, you know what, if you don't have sex with me, I'm going to break up. It's just not worth it. I can have sex with anybody. And they use things like that. And your daughters are not exempt from that. And you should be preparing them for that. You don't want them controlled by some control freak that doesn't care about them and shouldn't be a control freak. Some of you go to jobs. You have a boss that just, when you're there, you hate your job. You're walking on eggshells. You don't know if you're going to be fired or demoted. You don't know if you're doing good or not. It's just a terrible way to live. You're always on edge. For some in marriages, it's one of the spouse threatens to leave all the time. I'm going to leave. And you know what? Church people were no different. Christians, I've heard situations where they said, I'm going to divorce you. Then see what the church thinks of you. They'll hate you. You won't be a part of it anymore. It's a threat. It's a threat. Controllers also use guilt. Again, they may say it or they imply it. After all I've done for you, you can't do this one little thing for me. No, it doesn't have to be husband and wife. It can be friends. People will say, I thought we were friends. And you won't even do this? You won't even step up and cover for me? You call yourself a Christian. What kind of Christian are you anyway? It wouldn't help me out. I think of relatives. Lots of times our relatives like to control us. Could be in-laws or outlaws, our own laws, that kind of thing. And they say, oh, you never call me. You never, why don't you ever check in? Are you too busy for me? I could be dead for 2 weeks and you wouldn't know it. No, you'd just be dead. I wouldn't. But see, it's ways to make us feel guilty, threats and guilts. So how do we as Christians intentionally deal with those who are intentional or unintentionally try to control us and manipulate us? So what we're going to do is we're going to turn to a story in the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to look at an example of a person who tries to take control of Jesus, who wants to take Jesus out of the will of God, and he wants him in his will. Now, I want to give you a little context behind it, all right? If you look at the ministry of Jesus, the 3 years that he's in ministry, he is absolutely clear of his purpose. There is no doubt, none. You can go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you will see he clearly explains, here's why I'm here. This is what God, this is the plan. I'm going to do this. Very clear. He has these disciples with him. They're with him like all the time. They hear him explain, this is what I'm going to do. This is why I'm here. This is it. Amazing thing is, we often wonder, how comes they never get it? You realize that? They don't get it. They think in their mind that Jesus is going to set up the kingdom now, that they're going to overthrow the Romans, we're going to reestablish the kingdom of David, and they are going to be rulers. Even though Jesus is constantly saying, I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be tortured. There's going to be a fake trial. I'm going to be crucified. The third day I'm going to raise up. God's going to raise me back up. Very clear. They don't see it. And then it hits me. We understand it because why? We sit back and we read it. We can see the picture. They didn't have that. Makes me think of how sometimes we get an idea in our head. And some of us, we can talk to our children this way. They get an idea in their head and you try to explain to them it's not how it's going to work or whatever. And no, sir, that is how it's going to work. I don't hear you. You don't make sense. You don't know. You're not the boss. And we're no different. We get ideas in our head and we don't see the very facts, the reality that's in front of us. You know what I mean? Let's be honest. We're no different than the disciples. Not at all. So we have this situation, And it's in Matthew 16, starts in verse 21. And Jesus just goes over what I said with them again. They're heading toward Jerusalem. He says, we're going to get to Jerusalem. This is going to happen. I'm going to be betrayed, arrested, trial, beat, tortured, hung on a cross. But the third day, God's going to raise me up. And Peter, listen to what it says. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Now, a control freak will do this often. This is classic control freak. You're doing something, you're in a group, and you do something that's out of his control. He's freaking out, so he's going to try to get you away from the group so he can give threats, he can give guilt without the group hearing that. Always, they take them to the side. Classic. All right? Because they're trying to impose their will on you. And Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. He says, never, Lord, this will never, ever happen to you. What? You're not going to be betrayed. You're not going on trial. You're not going to be tortured. And you're not going to die. Because that messes up the kingdom plan. But he wasn't thinking about God's kingdom. He was thinking about Peter's. Big difference. And Jesus turns to Peter, and I love this. He looks at Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus turns to the other disciples. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. So, how do we love people who are trying to manipulate and control us? From this story, there's three important things we have to do. They're very important. This morning, this could be life-changing in your life. The first thing we need to do is we need to know, we need to clarify, we need to know what we are called to do. What is God's calling on your life? God's calling. Not anybody else, not your parents. You know, parents, sometimes we try to control our children because we say, you need to do this. This is where the good money is. This is where you'll be secure. This is where, and instead of doing that, we need to be first praying and saying, what's God's will in your life? Let me help you find God's will for you. Let's look at how we discover that. Well, too many of us have placed money over what God's will is. And it's a huge mistake. It's a control factor. We need to know what we are called to do. It's so clear. Jesus explains it. I said time and time again. When they said, why did he come? I came to seek and to save the lost. Remember that? Remember when Jesus said that? That's pretty clear, isn't it? I came to seek and to save the lost. He goes on, I did not come for those who are healthy. I came for the sick. Remember that? He talked to them. He was with the tax collectors and the Pharisees. Why are you eating with sinners? Well, I didn't come for the healthy. I didn't do that. I didn't come for those who are righteous, but I came for sinners. I didn't come so other people could serve me, but I came to serve them by giving my life a ransom for many. It is absolutely clear that Jesus understood his calling. All right? And that is where you and I need to be. I've got to give my life, he says. I'm going to suffer. It's God's calling on my life. In 3 days, he will raise me back up again. So it's really important for those of us, those of you who know someone who's trying to control your life, and you want to love them, because that's what we're called to do. That's love God, love others. And we know some people are harder to love, aren't they? Well, how do we do that in a controlling person? You have to know what God's calling is on your life. And so often, I've said this time and time again, I'm going to say it again this morning, is so many of us who say, well, I'm waiting for God to show me what my calling is. I'm waiting. And all the while God's there, no, move, do this. We have this notion that if God doesn't call me in some grandiose plan, like I'm hoping God calls me to be a missionary in Uganda or some other place in the world, or I think God's going to use me to cure cancer, so I'm waiting. Can I just share something? Basic. Your calling on your life is like ivory snow. 99.9% of us are exactly where God wants us to be now, and all He wants us to be is a witness and a living testimony to the glory of Jesus Christ where we are. Not waiting on doing some grand thing. Where we work, are we a testimony there? Are we just putting up, doing the job and complaining that I don't know the will of God? And all the while God's saying, be my witness. Show your job site what a real Christian looks like. Show what difference Jesus makes in your life. If you're a parent, be the parent. Be the parent God wants you to be. Be the influence, the godly influence of your children. You may never see that for the next 20 years, but it'll show up. It will show up. It's amazing that so often we think, I got to do this. And sometimes it's a season of our life. Maybe you're in college. You can be a testimony. You can show that whole school what it is to be a Christian and walk with Jesus and stand against a culture that's anti-Christian. You can do it. You say, well, I don't know if I'm called to this job. You are called to the job. No matter what it is, even if your job's temporary, even if it's not what you're going to do forever, you can be a witness. And I'm not saying that as though I'm in some ivory tower. Don't forget, I got 38 years in construction. 38 years to be a witness and to stand for Jesus Christ. And it's not easy, and it's not always fun, but it's well worth it because of the things that I've seen God do. I think for me, my calling is very clear. And I'm going to share, sort of in an order, what I think God has called me to, because my first is always God. God's above everything else. I want to worship and praise Him. God's then called me to love my wife. To love my wife. That's my calling. It's a calling. Why is that important? Let me tell you something. Our culture, our world is looking for truth. They really are. They want to see the power of Jesus Christ. They want to see some spiritual power, something deeper than what we see. And one of the greatest places we can show it is in our marriage. And when our marriage is committed and dedicated to Christ, and we love each other as Christ loved, we become a testimony to everything else. But where the church is today is we have a divorce rate that's equal or higher than our cultural birth rate. We're not shining there. We're not shining there. So one of my first callings as a pastor, as a person, is to love my wife. All right? My second calling, and this has changed in the season of my life. My calling right now is to assist my sons and my daughter-in-laws in raising up another generation for Jesus Christ. I can assist. I can mentor. I can't control it like a parent can. But a grandparent has influence. And it needs to assist the parent. And third, I'm called to lead this church. That's my calling. Lead. I could say pastor, but I'm not a shepherd. I know that's hard to understand. A shepherd's a different gift. We have shepherds here. We do. But I was called to lead, to take a church, change its course, do this, and I'm still doing that. All right? That's what I'm called to do. All in that time, and knowing what my calling is, I've had a lot of people who think they know better than I do how to follow my calling. Now look, I'm not always right, and I'm not trying to be whatever, but you see, a lot of times people say, I think we should be doing this. I think this should happen. We don't have this. We don't have that. I've already known that I can't do everything. I already know that I can't make everybody happy. If God can't, why do I think I can? I can be what God called me to be. I will do what God called me to do. And the other stuff, He's got somebody else. Or we're not ready for it. We have a problem, though. A lot of people, they struggle with being people pleasers. People pleasers. I'm trying to please people. We got any people pleasers in here? Come on, let's be honest. Any people? You're really concerned about people pleaser, right? All right? Some of you just raised your hand because you didn't want me not to have anybody hand up. So you just said, well, I'm going to raise my hand so he doesn't look like a fool. Well, I'm sorry, but you're a people pleaser. That very reason alone makes you a people pleaser. And what that is that's a dangerous place to be. It really is, because what we do is we place people over God. We're trying to please people over God. You know what the Bible calls that? Idolatry. It's like worshiping an idol. It's putting something above God. And that's a dangerous place to be. I just want you to know that. I want you to understand, as we try to please people and be certain things we're in a dangerous problem. We need to clarify our calling. We need to be very clear. This is what God's called me to. Because I said, so many people can have, it doesn't matter who you are. There's a lot of people that think, I know better than you. This is what you should be doing. I know you should have did this in the church. You should have did that. I've been told that time and time again by people. I think we should have did this. Other did that. Know your calling. Know what it is. When you know what you're called to do, it creates a clear path for you to take. A clear path. This is what I'm on. As a pastor, I wish I could save everybody. I wish I really could. I wish I just, now we're streaming, so boy, we go out all over the world. I mean, billions of people, not millions, billions of people can come to know Jesus Christ. It's probably not going to happen. Probably not going to happen. I can't be everywhere at the same time. I'm not God. I can't meet with everybody I ought to meet with. I can't do it. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can love my wife, I can love my family, and I can lead this church. That's what I'm called to do. That's my calling. And I'm not going to let others get in the way of what God's will is for my life. That's how we have to think. There's something else I want us to think about this, and this is really challenging. There's something that every controlling person has in common. Something every controlling person has in common. Every controlling person has a person who allows it. Oh, did you hear that? Ouch, that hurt. Because if I'm being controlled, I'd like to blame the controller. The reality of it is, every controlling person has someone who allows it. They allow it. We allowed it to happen. And that's why it's so absolutely important we clarify our calling, God's calling on our life. So in this season, what is it that God's calling you to? What is God blessing you with? Know what you're called to do. The second thing is know when somebody's trying to control you. Know when somebody is trying to control your life. Recognize it. Acknowledge it. Be aware of it. You can easily tell that with some things because they try to take you away from the things of God. They try to pull you away from family, from people who care about you. They want to sidetrack you, get you to the side so they can control you. Know when someone is trying to do that to you. Remember, Jesus said, I'm going to lay down my life and God's going to raise me up. And what does Peter do? Peter said, no, that's not going to happen. No, that's never, ever going to happen. Now, I want you to understand something. Was Peter a bad guy? No, Peter, we like Peter. He's a pretty neat guy. Was he intentionally trying to get Jesus away from God's plan? Nope. It was unintentional, but he was being used by the devil. He was a good guy, loved Jesus. But in this conversation, his will became more powerful in himself than God's will. He couldn't see God's will anymore. Couldn't see it. this interesting thing happened. They are walking just before this whole thing I just talked about happened. They're walking down the road, and Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am? Who do they say that I am?" And they start telling him, "Oh, Elijah and all these prophets," and they're going on. And it's almost funny. You hear them talking about it. They're saying, "Oh, I heard you this. Some think you're John the Baptist raised to the dead," which to me is like, well, wait a minute. John baptized Jesus. How does that work? Anyway, it's just one of those things that are funny. But then, it's really neat. If you think about it, Jesus played Jesus Jeopardy. He says, "But who do you think I am? Who do you think I am?" And Peter, instantly, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Bing, 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 bing. You win, Peter. That's it. That's it. You got it. But man didn't tell you this. You got that from the Holy Spirit. You got that from God. He revealed that to you. Peter said it. He said it, but he didn't comprehend it. He said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," but he did not comprehend what he said. Because just a little bit later when Jesus said, "Okay, it's right, here's what's going to happen," boom, 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 killed, raised, Peter says, no way, it's not going to happen. No. He went from winning Jesus Jeopardy, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan." Think about that. It blows me away. Why did Peter want to control Jesus? Because in that moment, he didn't understand God's plan at all. He couldn't put it together. 3 years with Jesus, Jesus kept saying what he was there to do, what was going to happen. And they didn't get it. The person controlling us may be a really good person. They may absolutely love you with everything they got. But we need to recognize that whether it's intentional or unintentional, when they're threatening us, or they're trying to guilt us, when they're trying to isolate us, manipulate us, we have to do something about that dance. We have to do something. So you have to know what your calling is. You got to realize this is the lane, this is the road this is my path that God wants me on. You have to acknowledge when somebody's trying to control you. And third, and this is a hard one. Third, you need to know when to draw a line in the sand. We need to know when to draw the line in the sand and say, "That's enough. That's enough." If you think about it, that's what happened with Jesus. "I'm going to do this." No, you're not. And then he says, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me." You ever say that out loud? You're reading it, "Get behind me, Satan." That's unique, isn't it? Let's say it together. Let's do that. Let's do this. Ready? "Get behind me, Satan." This is Peter. Peter. The rock. Peter wins Jesus Jeopardy. You got the right answer. God just spoke to you to "Get behind me, Satan." He goes on, remember? He says, "You are a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God. You're merely on human concerns." Just imagine for a minute. It's hard to imagine this, but imagine Jesus is codependent. Imagine that Jesus is so codependent, he's a people pleaser. He just wants to please people, all right? And he's telling Peter, "This is what's going to happen." And then Peter said, no, that isn't going to happen to you. And Jesus is like, "Whoa, Peter, calm down. Don't get upset. Don't get upset." "Well, if you do that, Jesus, if you go that way, I'm not going to talk to you. If you go that way, we'll unfriend you on Twitter." I'm sure they had an early type of Twitter back then. And, or Jesus, if you do that, I'm just going to stomp around and I'm going to pout. I won't be your disciple anymore. And if Jesus was codependent, he'd say, Peter, calm down, okay? I won't do it. I won't do it. You know, God and I, we sort of planned this to save all mankind, but I'll just lay that aside. And I just want you to be happy. Can't we just be happy? You want to have tea together? You know, that kind of thing. Think of Jesus. That's really hard to do it. And I'm glad he wasn't codependent. I'm glad he understood fully and completely what his calling was. And he would never for a moment give himself over to somebody else's control. And that's why it's so incredibly dangerous when we are controlled by somebody else, because we're not under the will of God. We're under somebody's personal will. And we need to recognize that somebody is taking your will away. Somebody who's trying to control you is taking your will away. Could be somebody who loves you, who cares about you. Someone that may not even realize they're doing it, but in their dysfunction, they're distracting you from the very calling of God on your life. Jesus told Peter in no uncertain terms, in this moment, you don't have in mind the things of God. You have merely human concerns, not godly things. Now just take a deep breath. We covered a lot, and it's not been easy. For some of us, this got really personal. This got close. What do we do? What do you do when you recognize, you know what? I'm in an unhealthy situation. I'm in an unhealthy dance. You know, the person's leading me. I can't even, it's unhealthy. It's not right. I can't do what God wants me to do. And I'm going to tell you some things that can be for you this morning extremely freeing. Freeing. And I pray that God's going to move. I'm going to share something that's hard to grasp. But this is true in any relationship that we have. Any relationship. In any of our relationships, we have a combination of what we have created, what we have helped created, and what we have allowed. Do you understand what I'm just saying? That if you are in a controlling situation, it is easy for us to blame that person who's controlling, but you allowed it. You allowed it. You helped create it. And now you allow it. One of the things that I see so many times in all my ministry is when marriages are in trouble, and I may speak to the husband, and the husband tells me how terrible the wife is, and how awful she does this, and this and that, and everything bad about her, and he makes it sound like he's just the victim. If you ever come to me for marriage advice and I send you to counseling or whatever, I'm not a good counselor, I want you to know I don't believe you. It takes two to tango. If I go over here and talk to your wife, there's a good chance she's going to say, my husband, he does this, he's terrible, he does this, but up. It takes two to tango. Your marriage is a combination of what you created and what you allowed. And some of us are in a really bad dance together. A really bad one. And you have to begin to take responsibility for your part in that dance. What you created and what you've allowed. And you might have passively allowed it, but you still allowed it. Now, if you realize that, if you come to that point where I can accept, you know what, you're right. You're right. I'm going to accept my responsibility, but what do I do? How do I change it? Well, listen, and this is important. If you don't like what you have, if you don't like the life you're living, if you don't like the dance that you're doing, change what you expect and change what you'll accept. Change what you expect and change what you accept. That's important. Jesus knew where to draw a line in the sand with Peter. That's it. We're not crossing there. It's not going to happen. You're not going to do this. What's that look like? You're not going to talk to me that way. That's inappropriate. That's not how you talk to somebody you love. I love you too much to have you yell at me. You don't use the divorce word. That's not something we use. Don't threaten me with it. That guilt you're putting on me, that's not me. That's on you. That's your guilt. You can't put it on me. Sometimes it may be a child that we love. And that child, we may have to draw a line in the sand and say, you know what? I love you with everything I got, but I'm not going to bail you out this time. Moms, dads, sometimes in this culture we're helicopter moms and dads. We're just hovering over our children. We're trying to protect them from everything and keep them from this and that. And we have to realize you are not God. You can't protect them. You can't change them. You and I do not have the power to change a single person, but God does. But God does. And we need to go to God who can change us and change individuals instead of us trying to take control and screwing everything up, because that's what we do. That's what we do. Is it difficult to do those things? Is it difficult to draw a line in the sand and say, that's unacceptable? Yes. I wish I could say it's like taking an aspirin and the headache goes away and everything's fine. It's not. It's difficult to say, that's it. I'm not accepting this anymore. What's going to happen? Well, it's just difficult. The person that's trying to control you is going to throw a fit. They're going to throw a fit. They're going to do what they normally do. They're going to sit there and they're going to give you the silent treatment. They're going to pout. They're going to stump, because you're going to change the dance, and that hurts. But I want to be honest with you about something. Every now and again, I look in the mirror, I can see the words control freak written on my forehead. I think, if we're honest, we all struggle with it. Because we think we're wiser, we know better. We got it. And we don't. We try to control things that are God's. And we need to let God be God and let us follow His will. I've had people say to me, you know, I see God's hand on you. It's amazing what God's doing. You ought to do it this way, their way, impose a will. But I can do the same thing. I can say, God's hand's on me. I'm doing this and that, and I think you need to do this. And sort of push and control people to maybe do things that God didn't call them to. I think we can all try to control what God never intended for us to control. Jesus looked at the disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. In other words, Jesus is saying, you cannot be God. You cannot control it. Wake up. This is not how it works. You're deceiving yourself. And just like I'm going to have to give my life for many, you too will have to take up your cross and follow me. Essentially, look, you need to make some decisions. You need to say, we're going to dance differently. I want to dance in God's will. I want God's will in my life. I'd love to see God's will in yours. I can't control you, but we're going to dance differently. Clarify your calling. Know what God's called you to. Know when somebody's trying to control your life over the will of God. And know when it's time to draw a line in the sand and say, enough is enough. This is unacceptable. And it won't be easy. It'll be difficult and rocky. But I want to tell you something. When you finally get it right, and you realize there's a new dance, and you start to dance to the music that God plays, you will never, ever want to try to control it on your own. Would you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, as we come to you this morning, as we're looking at relationships, this is heavy. This is something that so many of us struggle with. It can be wives or husbands. It can be parents on their children. It can be our older parents on married children. It can be bosses, superintendents. It can be friends. And we're almost afraid to make a move, but Father, help us to see that we're to be in your will. We're to know what it is you called us to do. And I'm just praying, Father, that I'm praying, Father, as we talk about being controlled by somebody else, that you will help everyone who is in that situation to take the first step and draw the line in the sand and say, enough is enough. Help us take the first step is what I pray, Jesus, in your name. Amen.